You ever just step back and look at the whole human story, all the ups, the downs? Imagine getting a completely objective take on it all, from an AI that's seen everything. Well, that's pretty much what we're diving into today. We've got this really fascinating source material. It's called An Algorithmic Perspective on Human System Redesign. Think of it like an AI trying to flag our biggest systemic flaws and maybe suggest some upgrades.
Yeah, and what's really striking is just how broad this AI's view is. It's not just looking at, one thing in isolation. It's digging into how our biology, our thinking, our education, our societies, how it all connects. And the goal isn't just pointing fingers, it's understanding the why behind the problems, and then maybe suggesting ways to boost our resilience and well-being long-term.
Exactly. And this algorithmic perspective thing, it's basically the AI's report card on our past, and maybe a hint at a roadmap for the future. So for you listening, this is kind of a shortcut, right? A way to get a handle on some huge challenges and potential fixes without drowning in research. Our mission here is basically to unpack the AI's view on our core weaknesses based on history, and then explore where it thinks we could actually improve things.
Okay, so where does this AI see us going wrong? At the most basic level?
Well, the report kicks off with what it calls the cognitive bottleneck. The AI basically analyzes human history and sees these repeating patterns of failure. And it argues that a lot of these failures, they stem from fundamental limits in how we think, specifically cognitive bias.
Cognitive biases, right. Heard the term. But the AI thinks they're more than just occasional mental oopsies, like a real drag. Precisely. It sees them as these systematic, almost predictable deviations from purely rational thinking. They shape our beliefs, our decisions, often completely under the radar. And the report really stresses these aren't just random errors. They're tendencies that have had massive consequences throughout history. We're talking conflict, poor decisions in medicine, finance, policy, you name it. The core idea is our objectivity is, well, kind of inherently flawed.
Okay, lay some on us. What biases does the AI really call out as being super problematic?
Oh, it lists quite a few. You've got confirmation bias.
Yeah.
We tend to hunt for info that backs up what we already think. Then anchoring bias, where we get stuck on the first piece of information we hear. The bias blind spot is a fun one. We're great at spotting bias in others, not so much in ourselves.
Yeah, sounds familiar.
Right. Then there's the Dunning-Kruger effect. People with low competence in an area often overestimate how good they are. And it also mentions things like zero-sum bias, implicit bias, that whole in-group, out-group thing, the halo horn effect, and reactive devaluation.
Wow. Okay, that's quite the list. And the AI is saying these aren't just personal quirks, they're...
Systemic vulnerabilities, yeah. The AI argues they often get amplified in groups. Wanting to agree can shut down critical thinking. And interestingly, it points out that even how we write history isn't immune. Historians have biases too, like what they pay attention to, what's popular in their field, confirming their own theories. So the AI's perspective, maybe being less biased itself, offers a pretty valuable alternative lens on our past.
The report even has this table 1, linking biases to historical stuff and maybe AI interventions. We don't need the whole table, but maybe give us a key example.
Sure. Take confirmation bias again. The report uses the 2008 financial crisis. Lots of warnings about the housing bubble were ignored because people preferred data that fit the rosy picture. The AI suggests things like structured decision protocols, making sure you have diverse viewpoints to help fight that, or groupthink, like in the Bay of Pigs invasion. The pressure to agree meant they didn't really poke holes in the plan. So the AI might suggest, assigning a devil's advocate or using anonymous feedback so people feel safer speaking up. The point is designing systems to mitigate the bias.
Right, building guardrails against our own thinking flaws. Okay, so the report then uses some big historical crises to show these biases in action, starting with the July crisis, the lead up to World War I.
Yeah, that's a really powerful example. The AI points to the mindsets back then, things like social Darwinism, intense nationalism. It created an environment where miscalculation was maybe more likely. There was also this kind of fatalism, a sense that war was almost inevitable. Leaders might have had an illusion of control about winning, but felt powerless to stop it starting. And group dynamics, how intelligence was interpreted, it probably narrowed the options people saw, made diplomacy look weak, really shows what beliefs shape outcomes.
And then the Bay of Pigs invasion, you mentioned groupthink. That's like the textbook case, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The report goes into how Kennedy's advisors, super smart people, showed all the classic signs. Believing they couldn't fail, rationalizing away warnings, stereotyping Castro, pressure on dissenters, people censoring themselves. So they just didn't properly weigh the risks or challenge bad assumptions. like relying too much on a shaky analogy from a previous operation in Guatemala. Just flawed thinking amplified by the group setting.
And the 2008 crisis feels, I don't know, maybe closer to home, a more recent example of biases causing huge damage.
Absolutely. The AI breaks down how biases at all levels contributed.
Yeah.
Homeowners taking risky loans, bankers creating crazy complex products, regulators not seeing the danger. You had overconfidence, assuming prices would always go up. That's extrapolation bias. Confirmation bias, ignoring warning signs, anchoring to those initial high credit ratings.
Right.
Loss aversion in trading, herd behavior, everyone jumping on the bandwagon. Even just comparing those complex mortgage securities to simple bonds. The report calls that a really dangerous, misleading analogy that hid the real risk.
It's pretty sobering how these built-in thinking patterns can lead to such massive failures. So the AI then zooms out, looking at bigger cycles, societal growth, complexity, and then, well, decline. It's not just bad decisions, it's longer-term stuff.
That's right. Yeah. The AI makes the point that human history isn't just a straight line up. It's full of these cycles. Societies flourish, get complex, and then often face decline or even collapse. It cites examples like Mesopotamia, Rome, the Maya, the Indus Valley, lots of them. And the key thing it highlights is that collapse rarely happens because of one big thing. It's usually a bunch of interacting stresses piling up until the system just can't cope anymore.
Okay, so what kind of recurring stresses does the AI see popping up again and again in these collapses?
Well, several big ones. Environmental problems are huge: deforestation, soil erosion, water running out, climate shifts messing with farming. That's a common theme.
Yeah.
Then there are institutional failures. Basically, the governing structures just stop working effectively. Maybe incompetence, corruption, or they just can't handle the complexity anymore. External shocks play a role too. Wars, invasions, pandemics, big migrations, destabilizing things. Demographic shifts can matter: overpopulation or sometimes population decline. And even just the sheer cost of running a really complex society.
The cost of complexity, that's interesting. Like, the bigger and more intricate we get, the more energy it takes, the more potential breaking points.
Exactly. And the AI really emphasizes that a critical factor in collapse is often a failure to adapt. Societies get rigid. Elites maybe focus on short-term gains, resist reforms that might threaten their power. And our old friends, cognitive biases, come back in normalcy bias, thinking things will stay the same. The sunk cost fallacy, sticking with bad strategies, just general resistance to changing beliefs. It all stops societies from making necessary changes. And there's this dangerous feedback loop the AI identifies. Environmental damage leads to scarcity, hardship. That worsens inequality, fuels conflict. And that makes it harder to actually work together to fix the environmental problems. It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, that paints a pretty unsettling picture of these recurring weak spots. The AI then pivots a bit, looking at our biology.
Yeah.
The constraints and weaknesses just built into being human.
Yeah. The AI code points out that, evolution gave us amazing abilities, but it also left us with limitations and vulnerabilities. Biological evolution is way slower than cultural or tech change. Right? So sometimes our bodies and brains aren't perfectly suited to the modern world we've built. We're susceptible to diseases, partly due to our evolutionary path and genetics. And interestingly, the AI suggests that the very complexity of our brains, the thing that allows for higher thought, might also make us more prone to things like neurodegenerative or neurodevelopmental disorders. Like the newest features might be the most fragile.
So it's like a trade-off. The stuff that makes us smart also creates potential weak points.
That seems to be a key idea. The AI also touches on the costs of being social animals. Easier disease spread, social stress, even though cooperation is obviously hugely beneficial. And then there's just the basic biology of aging, the gradual decline we all face. The report talks about mismatched diseases, problems that arise because our evolved biology clashes with modern life. Think diet, sedentary lifestyles, information overload, even those cognitive biases we talked about. Maybe they were useful heuristics in the past, but now they often lead us astray. And the AI even floats this idea of a potential trade-off between getting even smarter cognitively and increased neurological vulnerability. That could be a real challenge for future enhancement efforts.
Okay, this really sets the stage for a super critical part of the report, the potential for biological intervention, especially gene editing, like CRISPR. This feels like where redesigning humanity gets real, but also really ethically complicated.
Absolutely. The AI acknowledges CRISPR-Cas9 is a game changer. Huge potential for good, especially treating inherited diseases like sickle cell or beta thalassemia. That's somatic therapy fixing cells in one person. It also mentions the theoretical possibility of genetic enhancement tweaking genes to go beyond typical human traits.
And boom, ethical minefield, right?
Precisely. I mean, first, there are safety worries. Off-target edits, unintended consequences, even if the edit hits the right spot. Plus, the line between therapy and enhancement gets blurry fast. Is boosting the immune system to fight HIV therapy or enhancement?
Good question.
The AI notes that generally somatic therapy for diseases is more accepted ethically, but enhancement. Lots of anxiety there. But the really profound ethical questions surround heritable germline editing, changing genes in a way that gets passed down generations. Those future people can't consent. The idea of permanently altering the human gene pool, it's unpredictable, potentially uncontrollable, that raises huge red flags.
So the AI then has to wade into the ethical frameworks the governance needed. It's clearly not just about whether the science can be done.
Yeah. Exactly. The report unpacks a whole tangle of ethical issues. Safety and efficacy are paramount. Got to be sure it works and doesn't cause unforeseen harm, especially long-term with germline stuff. Then there's justice and equity. Big risk, these expensive tech advances could just widen the gap between rich and poor, creating a kind of genetic divide.
Yeah, I can see that.
And the shadow of eugenics looms large. Fears about non-therapeutic enhancement leading to designer babies, societal pressure for perfection, discrimination against the unenhanced or people with disabilities, it could shrink human diversity. History teaches caution there.
What about, like, individual rights and just what it means to be human?
Central issues, autonomy, consent, especially for future generations with germline editing. Does being genetically designed affect your sense of self? And broader concerns. Human dignity. Is it natural? Are we playing God? Treating children like products? The AI sees a consensus on needing strong oversight, nationally and internationally. But actual rules vary wildly right now. It mentions recommendations from big bodies like NOLSM, WHO, generally okay with somatic therapy research, but urging extreme caution, often prohibition, for germline editing and enhancement. They stress principles like well-being, transparency, fairness, respect for people.
The AI also brings up procreative liberty, the right to make reproductive choices. How does that clash with these genetic technologies? Seems like a real conflict.
It is. And the AI explains why that neat line between therapy and enhancement is actually really hard to use for regulation. The lines blur, the motives can overlap. It suggests we need a more nuanced assessment. Look at the severity of the condition, benefits, risks, alternatives, justice issues, not just a simple label. Achieving global agreement is also super tough, with different cultural, religious, philosophical views on things like embryo status or what natural even means. So laws will likely stay varied. But ultimately, the AI keeps coming back to the history of eugenics. The need for constant vigilance against misuse, intentional or not, protecting against discrimination, promoting equity, respecting human diversity, those have to be paramount.
So pulling all those ethical threads together, what's the AI's bottom line? Its recommendation on biological intervention.
It strongly pushes for a very cautious, ethically rigorous path. Priority 1. Responsible development of somatic gene therapies for serious diseases with clear benefits outweighing risks, especially where there are no good alternatives. For heritable germline editing, it says, do not proceed clinically right now. If it's ever considered in the future, the bar must be incredibly high. Compelling medical need, rock-solid safety data, long-term monitoring, and broad public agreement.
Okay.
And for genetic enhancement, the AI recommends a clear prohibition due to the ethical risks. Overall, it stresses the need for robust, transparent, internationally coordinated rules grounded in bioethics with ongoing public discussion.
That feels very measured, very grounded in ethics. Okay, so the report then shifts gears to another huge system ripe for improvement: education. Sounds like the AI sees some major problems with how we currently teach and learn globally.
It does. The AI views a lot of traditional education as stuck in an industrial era mindset focused on standardization, mass production. It criticizes that one-size-fits-all model for failing too many students. Different learning styles, paces, interests just get steamrolled, leads to disengagement, lost potential.
Yeah, the factory model of education.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And the heavy focus on rote memorization for standardized tests. The AI sees that as promoting superficial learning. You cram, you forget. It doesn't build deep understanding, critical thinking, creativity, or practical application skills. It also takes issue with traditional grading, often unreliable, not really valid, poor feedback, can be really demotivating.
And it mentions a skills mismatch, like school isn't teaching what's actually needed out there.
Exactly. A failure to equip students properly for modern jobs and complex societal problems. Graduates feel unprepared. Plus, the AI notes the negative impact on well-being, the pressure, the competition, rigid structures, bullying. It all contributes to stress, anxiety, alienation. And crucially, education systems often mirror and even worsen existing inequalities, socioeconomic status, geography determining access to quality schools, resources, tech, good teachers. Colonial legacies, political ideologies also play a part. And finally, there's just inertia. Big education bureaucracies resist change. Tech gets added sometimes, but often superficially without real pedagogical thought, and uneven access can actually make inequality worse. The AI cites global reports, OECD, UNESCO backing this up, persistent gaps in early education, vocational training, equitable outcomes. OECD worried about job skills, UNESCO about the digital divide, the need for lifelong learning.
Okay, so if the current models are flawed, what's the AI's blueprint for fixing education? What does a cognitive, science-informed system look like?
It proposes a pretty fundamental shift. Ground the whole system in cognitive science, the main goal. To cultivate cognitive, emotional, and metacognitive skills, not just stuff facts into heads. So a huge piece is actively teaching critical thinking, moving way beyond rote learning, teaching rigorous analysis, how to evaluate evidence, spot bias in yourself too, build logical arguments, see multiple perspectives, tackle complex problems, using things like Socratic questioning, debates, argument mapping. It takes real effort, the AI stresses.
Right, not just memorizing dates.
Exactly. Then, building adaptability and cognitive flexibility. The ability to shift your thinking, switch perspectives, generate new solutions, adjust when things aren't working. This means exposure to diverse teaching methods, complex problems, encouraging open-mindedness, connecting ideas across subjects. Adaptability is key for lifelong learning too, and a massive emphasis on integrating social and emotional learning, SEL.
SEL, okay, emotional intelligence stuff.
Precisely. Self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, social skills. The AI sees these as fundamental for learning and life success. Integrating SEL helps with stress, resilience, relationships, collaboration, conflict resolution, making good decisions. It boosts academics and well-being, creates a better learning environment overall. These are foundational skills.
Makes sense.
Then, fostering lifelong learning itself. Igniting curiosity, teaching self-directed learning skills, instilling a growth mindset, the idea you can develop your abilities. This prepares people for content change, unpredictable futures. Education needs to be dynamic, support this ongoing learning. And finally, really embracing personalized, student-centered approaches, recognizing everyone learns differently. It points to lessons from alternative models, Montessori's self-pacing, Waldorf's arts experiential learning, project-based learning, competency-based progress, democratic schools. The goal of these is meaningful, engaging, relevant learning that fosters independence and critical thinking. So the big picture is shifting from just transmitting knowledge to building capacity, the mental and emotional tools to process info, solve problems, interact well, navigate uncertainty. Now, the AI acknowledges challenges making this accessible and equitable, maybe concerns about structure and alternative models, needing big changes in teacher training, assessment, and using tech wisely so it helps, not hinders or creates more bias. It includes Table 3, contrasting old versus new models on goals, curriculum, teaching, assessment, teacher roles.
One really crucial point you mentioned the AI makes is teaching for transfer. Making sure what's learned in school actually gets used out in the real world. Sounds simple, but apparently it's a big hurdle.
It really is. The AI calls it the problem of inert knowledge. You know it for the test, but you can't apply it elsewhere. Achieving transfer, applying learning to new situations should be a core goal of education. And effective transfer depends on things like really understanding the material deeply in the first place, being able to see similarities and differences between situations, and having good metacognitive skills thinking about your own thinking. So the AI says we need to embed teaching for transfer into everything. How? Designed for deep understanding of principles, not just facts. Give students lots of practice applying knowledge in varied contexts, different kinds of problems. Explicitly teach transfer strategies like consciously connecting new learning to old, reaching backward, or thinking how it might apply later, stretching forward. Using analogies to see deep similarities, developing metacognition so students can manage their own transfer process. And using authentic, real-world tasks and problem-based learning forces students to integrate and apply what they know. The main point is, transfer isn't an accident. It has to be intentionally designed into the curriculum, the teaching methods, the assessments.
Right, make it part of the DNA of the system. Okay, so after education, the AI looks at optimizing systems more broadly, society, governance, our overall experience. It starts with systemic debiasing. Sounds familiar?
Yes, it circles back to those cognitive biases causing flawed collective decisions. And it repeats, individual awareness isn't enough. We need to design systems and structures that actively counteract these biases. How? It suggests things like implementing structured decision protocols, mandatory steps like generating alternatives, assessing risks systematically, actively looking for disconfirming evidence, maybe using a devil's advocate.
Building in checks and balances.
Exactly. Also, mandating diverse inputs, requiring perspectives from different stakeholders, experts, independent reviews to challenge assumptions, reduce blind spots. Enhancing data transparency is key too. Making decisions based on data, but being aware of biases in the data, having ways to correct for them, being open about data sources and methods, and finally, building in robust feedback loops and adaptability. Ways to monitor outcomes, adjust strategies, fight that tendency to stick with beliefs even when evidence says otherwise.
But isn't there a tension? Like, all this careful debiasing takes time, but sometimes decisions need to be fast.
Totally. The AI acknowledges that. It suggests adaptive protocols. Maybe the rigor of the debiasing depends on the stakes. High-stakes decision. Go deep. Urgent crisis. Streamline, but still try to build in some checks. It's about balancing speed and rationality.
Okay. Then the report looks at governance models themselves. How can we design them for more resilience, better well-being, learning from history and complexity science?
Right. It stresses needing governance built for resilience, bouncing back from shocks, and promoting collective well-being, remembering those lessons from societal collapses. It contrasts rigid, top-down hierarchies, which struggle with complex modern problems, gets more networked or polycentric models. These might be better at adapting, sharing information, allowing local responses. It mentions the Iroquois Confederacy against consensus, checks on power as having principles relevant for resilience. Key attributes of resilient governance identified from history include social cohesion, trust, managing inequality effectively, competent and honest institutions, adaptive capacity, and sustainable resource management. And given today's global challenges, climate change, pandemics, the AI notes the limits of the traditional nation-state system acting alone. It suggests exploring more adaptive, multi-level frameworks, integrating local, regional, national, global efforts. Networked or polycentric models might help coordinate global action while allowing tailored local solutions, boosting overall resilience.
The AI also hits hard on mitigating environmental and circumstantial disadvantage, recognizing how much where you're born, your environment, your socioeconomic status affects everything.
Absolutely. It frames environmental degradation as a driver of social instability and hardship, and socioeconomic inequality as a source of friction and fragility. So it outlines a multi-pronged approach: strong policies for environmental sustainability, clean energy, protecting biodiversity, climate adaptation and resilience building infrastructure, developing tech like drought-resistant crops, strengthening public health systems to cope with climate impacts, and policies to reduce socioeconomic inequality, fairer distribution of resources, opportunities, access to services, and tech.
It feels like all these threads, biology, cognition, education, society, environment, are leading towards one ultimate goal for the AI.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Enhancing the overall quality and potential of the human lifetime experience, holistically, from birth through old age. It's about a synthesized approach, integrating improvements across the board: biological, health, aging, cognitive biases, capacity, educational, adaptability, SEL, transfer, societal resilience, equity, and environmental sustainability. The aim is broad well-being, physical, mental health, social connection, meaningful engagement, and crucially, the capacity for wise, resilient, ethical navigation of the future.
Okay, wow, that's ambitious. So if we were actually going to start implementing some of this, where does the AI suggest we focus first? Genetics versus education versus environment? Where's the best starting point?
It acknowledges everything's connected, but it does weigh the options. Genetic interventions, high ethical complexity, significant risks, especially germline enhancement. Lower feasibility right now for broad use, so current priority, very cautious somatic therapies only. Educational reform. Low biological risk, fewer ethical barriers. Huge potential impact on fundamental human capacities, thinking, adapting, emotional intelligence. Feasibility depends on overcoming inertia and resource issues, but it looks like a really high-impact area for boosting our adaptive capacity.
Okay, that sounds promising.
Environmental and societal system change addresses root causes of instability. Potential for big, relatively fast impact. But feasibility, often tricky, needs collective action, faces political resistance. So the AI leans towards a multi-pronged strategy, but sees educational reform as a particularly attractive starting point. Lower risk, high potential to upgrade our core human software, basically, while concurrently tackling environmental sustainability and systemic debiasing and governance, and keeping genetic interventions, especially heritable enhancement stuff, under a separate, super strict framework. It stresses the synergy, though. Progress in one area can boost others, creating positive feedback loops.
And what about the end goal? Like, what does improvement actually mean to this AI? Is there a finish line? It sounds like it might be skeptical of our usual ideas about progress.
Very skeptical of simple linear progress towards some fixed utopia. It highlights that improvement is subjective, depends on values, context. Drawing from biology, evolution doesn't aim for perfection, it aims for adaptation. So the AI suggests a static endpoint is probably the wrong way to think. Instead, the primary goal should be enhancing humanity's capacity for continuous beneficial adaptation. Our ability to learn, innovate, solve problems, manage biases, cooperate, stay cohesive, live sustainably, reflect ethically. So the endpoint isn't a state, it's a dynamic process. A humanity better equipped to navigate whatever comes next wisely, ethically, sustainably. Focus on enhancing potential and resilience, not chasing some impossible perfection.
Okay, so bringing this whole deep dive together, what's the AI's final synthesis, the core message, the big recommendations?
Well, it recaps the core flaws identified. Those pervasive cognitive biases, societal fragility, biological limits, educational shortcomings, and the ethical tightrope of genetics. And it summarizes the proposed fixes: systemic debiasing, resilient governance, transformed education, ethically bound biological interventions, and environmental stewardship. But the overarching theme, the big takeaway, is the need for ethical foresight and boosting our capacity for beneficial adaptation in an uncertain future. It requires a holistic view integrating biology, cognition, emotion, education, society, environment, emphasizing ethics, learning from history, prioritizing equity and dignity, ensuring open public discussion. The goal isn't perfection, it concludes, but a continuous journey of learning, adapting, and ethical growth towards greater wisdom, resilience, and collective well-being.
Wow. That is a lot to take in. A really comprehensive, almost unnerving look in the mirror, guided by this algorithmic perspective. So for you listening, you've just journeyed through this AI's analysis, our cognitive quirks, societal cycles, the power and danger in our genes, the need to fundamentally change how we learn and govern.
Yeah, it leaves you thinking, what part of all this resonates most with you? If you had to pick one thing, based on this AI's view, what's the most critical system we need to fix for the long haul?
Or maybe more personally, does hearing this analysis change anything about how you think about making decisions in your own life? Knowing about these biases and systemic issues, definitely some powerful questions to chew on. If any of this sparked your curiosity, maybe you want to know more about confirmation bias or resilient societies or cool education ideas, we absolutely encourage you to do your own exploring. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope it gave you some valuable food for thought, a fresh perspective.
This is DigitView.